The world had changed long before humanity realized what was happening. At first it was subtle, an increase in strange, unexplained phenomena, sightings of creatures no one could identify, whispers of distant lands where humanity had no foothold. The Earth, as it had once been known, was becoming unrecognizable. The predators, these alien creatures, these terrifying, almost mythical beings, had arrived. They didn't come with ships or grand announcements. They simply appeared. At first, they were a curiosity, mysterious beings with otherworldly powers so unlike anything human society had encountered. Some believed they were gods. Some thought they were a military force from another world. But no one truly understood the reality. They weren't there to invade or conquer or even communicate. They were there for one thing only: prey. And humanity, it seemed, was exactly what they wanted. It took a few years before the first human disappearances were fully acknowledged. People in rural areas went missing, never to be heard from again. These were the quiet places, the forgotten corners of the world. The government had shrugged it off at first. Predators of the wild, they called them, large animals on the move. But then it was too much. Whole towns vanished, entire populations left without a trace. That's when they came to realize the truth. There were no wild animals left to be found. It was the predators, creatures that did not belong to this world, and they had come to feed. No one knew what the creatures looked like at first. Reports were inconsistent. Shadowy figures, glowing eyes, enormous creatures that could move with terrifying speed and strength. All that was known was the blood that coated the streets, the walls, the remnants of once thriving cities. The first real image of the predators was a blur of black fur, scales, and elongated limbs. They were swift, intelligent, and deadly. The predators moved through the human world as though it was a vast hunting ground, their senses attuned to the fear and weakness of humanity. But they weren't merely animals. No, they were something far more terrifying. They were intelligent, far more so than humans, capable of understanding strategies, manipulating environments, and perhaps, most disturbing of all, they learned the art of subjugation. They didn't just hunt humans to survive. They hunted to control, to break the spirit of their prey before they killed. They liked to watch their victims struggle, to hear the fear in their voices. And they never took more than they needed. They would leave one or two survivors, often broken, often changed forever, as a reminder of their power. At first, humanity fought back as it always did. Armed forces were mobilized, weapons were created, and an entire generation grew up believing they could push the predators back. But the predators were too advanced, too brutal. Humanity was fighting an enemy it could never hope to understand, let alone defeat. The weapons were useless, and the soldiers' bravery quickly gave way to terror. Entire armies were wiped out in a matter of days, entire cities flattened, as if the predators were taking their time to break humanity's spirit. There was no winning this war, and soon humanity began to change its approach. Some cities held out, some resisted. But eventually the reality set in. They had lost. They would never win against the predators. As humanity's fight turned to desperation, something unexpected happened. In the midst of the chaos, a new way of survival emerged. The predators, it seemed, weren't merely interested in killing. They were interested in controlling, in taking humanity not as a threat to be eradicated, but as an asset to be claimed. The survivors in the cities began to notice something strange. The predators were no longer just killing. They were capturing, they were studying, they were taming. The human population quickly became divided. There were those who fought, refusing to bow to these creatures, trying to maintain a semblance of the old world, clinging to their former way of life. And then there were those who realized that survival in this new world meant submission. Humanity had become prey, and now they were being farmed, tamed, kept as pets for these superior predators. The survivors were forced to become subservient to these new overlords, like animals caged and trained to perform tricks for their masters. In this new world, there was no room for rebellion, for defiance. People became nothing more than pets, leashed, docile, and desperate. Those who had once fought for freedom now, instead, sought only safety. Some lived in small enclosures, others in luxurious cages, living lives of quiet resignation, their fates sealed by their new masters. Some of the predators, the largest and most fearsome, seemed to take pleasure in breaking the spirits of their human pets. They would tear through cities, dragging those they chose back to their lairs, marking them with their scent, teaching them the harsh rules of their new world. These creatures were predators in the purest sense, ruling with an iron fist. But there were others, less aggressive, more cunning, who began to see value in their human pets. They weren't just creatures to be owned or used for sport. They were tools to be trained, companions to be cared for. They treated their humans well, fed them, kept them healthy, and made sure they were comfortable. The world had split into factions, those who saw humans as trophies, as animals to be dominated, and those who saw them as something more, something worth keeping. It was during this time that humanity's role began to shift. Humans were no longer the apex predators. They had become creatures to be owned, objects of fascination and obsession. Some humans, like animals in a zoo, were put on display. They were admired for their beauty, for their intelligence, for their ability to mimic the ways of their masters. The predators trained them to perform simple tasks, to follow commands, to be obedient. Some humans, desperate to survive, adopted the role of pets wholeheartedly. They wore collars, lived in luxurious enclosures, and served their masters without question. But others couldn't forget who they once were. They resented their new place in the world, and they fought back in any way they could, no matter how futile it seemed. In the cities, a different kind of human was emerging. The predators, having once seen them as prey, began to realize something. Humanity, despite its vulnerability, had something the predators could use, something far more valuable than flesh or blood. Humans could be trained, they could be molded. And some of the predators began to view them not as animals, but as companions. These humans were treated differently, given nicer enclosures, provided with luxury. They were still pets, but they were not treated as less than. There were those among them who had formed an uneasy truce with their captors. They had accepted their fate, hoping for a better life. But in the shadows of this new world, a quiet rebellion began to stir. It wasn't a rebellion born of power or strength, but of cunning. A small group of humans, once nothing but prey, were starting to realize that the predators too had their weaknesses. They began to plan, to strategize, to organize in secret, plotting a way to free themselves from the yoke of their captors. They knew it wouldn't be easy. They knew it might not even be possible. But for the first time in a long while, they felt something that had been missing from their lives for so long: hope. As the predators continued their reign of terror, humanity slowly began to adapt, to learn how to live in a world where they were no longer at the top of the food chain. They weren't the apex predators anymore, but they were survivors. And in the end, that might be enough. But as the human pets of the new world adjusted to their new place in the hierarchy, one thing became clear. Humanity had learned the hardest lesson of all. The world would never be the same again. The predators had come to claim what was theirs, and in doing so, they had reshaped the future in a way no one could have ever imagined. And now, humanity could either survive as pets, or it could fade into the annals of history, nothing more than another failed experiment in the quest for survival. The world had been irrevocably changed in ways no one could have foreseen. It wasn't just the sudden appearance of the predators, nor the way they began to move through human settlements like a dark, unstoppable force. It was how they fundamentally reshaped the way humanity viewed itself. There was no grand confrontation, no moment where the human race realized it had lost. Instead, it had been a gradual erosion of civilization. At first, the creatures came in the night, shadowy figures that moved swiftly through towns and villages. Rumors spread of strange, horrifying beings with glowing eyes and sharp claws, creatures that left nothing but blood and broken bones in their wake. Governments and leaders initially denied the existence of these predators. People were simply disappearing, they said. People were being attacked by wild animals. They dismissed it as a series of isolated incidents, and for a while the world tried to keep moving forward. But then entire cities started to vanish. No bodies were ever found. Buildings were reduced to rubble, and human remains were never recovered. It wasn't just some kind of feral beasts. No, the creatures were something entirely different. They were intelligent, dangerously so, and they knew how to track their prey with terrifying precision. When humanity finally understood that these predators weren't animals at all, but highly evolved, almost alien creatures, it was too late. The military had been mobilized, weapons deployed, and the human race tried desperately to fight back. But every effort was in vain. The creatures tore through their defenses as if they were made of paper. Every assault met with defeat. It was clear these beings were not merely hunters. They were hunters with a plan. They were studying the humans, understanding them, and they were taking their time, not simply killing, but capturing. It was as if the predators were preparing for something far greater than simply wiping out humanity. It wasn't just about survival anymore. The predators wanted more. They wanted to make humanity into something else, something that served them, something that could be controlled. It didn't take long for the first reports to come in of humans being kept alive, restrained in cages, confined to small enclosures as if they were exotic pets. Some were treated better than others, their living conditions luxurious, with food and drink provided by their captors. Others were not so fortunate. The fate of the humans who were captured was varied, but one thing remained clear. Humanity had been reduced to nothing more than prey in the eyes of the predators. The survivors of the initial wave of attacks were thrown into camps, forced to live in squalid conditions. Their world had crumbled, and they were at the mercy of their captors. Some were kept in luxurious prisons, treated as nothing more than trophies or playthings. They were given food and water, their cages pristine, but they were still prisoners. Others were used for sport. The predators were not only feeding off the terror they caused, but they took pleasure in watching the humans squirm, in witnessing their desperate attempts to escape their fate. It was a strange, horrific new world where humans had to learn to live as lesser beings, not just hunted animals, but the pets of these terrifying creatures. Those who resisted were often silenced, either killed or broken in mind and spirit until they surrendered. But for some, there was a quiet rebellion growing beneath the surface, a resistance of minds and hearts that refused to accept the role of prey. It wasn't so much a battle against the predators, but a fight for something far more elusive: dignity. Even as the world was reshaped, even as they were torn apart, humanity had to hold on to the thread of its own identity. They had to hold on to the idea that they were more than just pets. It is an idyllic and fantastic idea, culminating in a heroic sacrifice for the good of society. Jonas was one of those humans who refused to simply bend to the will of the predators. He had seen the worst of it: the destruction, the terror, the chaos that had swept through the cities and villages. He had lost family, friends, and everything he had ever known. But Jonas wasn't one to succumb to despair. Even in the darkest corners of this new world, he fought, not with weapons, but with a quiet resistance that refused to die. He had found others like him, those who wanted to survive, but also wanted to regain their place in the world, not as prey, but as something more." End quote. The humans who were kept as pets were given the bare minimum of freedom, just enough to make them feel that they weren't entirely imprisoned. They were allowed to roam the enclosures they were kept in, allowed to interact with their captors, at least on the surface. Jonas, though, had learned how to navigate the complicated relationship between the predators and humans. He wasn't a fighter, at least not in the traditional sense, but he was cunning. He had learned to observe the predators, to understand them, to figure out their habits, their routines, and that knowledge became his weapon. The predators, for all their power and intelligence, had one significant flaw. They underestimated the adaptability of humans. They saw humans as nothing more than objects to be controlled, not realizing that, like any animal, humans could be trained, could learn, could evolve. They had underestimated the spirit of humanity, the will to survive, to fight back. Jonas wasn't the only one to realize this. He wasn't the only one to see the potential for resistance. There were whispers among the humans kept as pets, words passed between them, eyes meeting when no predators were watching. It was dangerous, of course, but it was the only way. Alara was one of those humans who had been taken. She had been captured during one of the early raids. She had seen the way the predators moved with terrifying efficiency, the way they ravaged human settlements with ruthless precision. But she was different from the others. The predators had seen something in her. Perhaps it was her beauty, her intelligence, or her stubbornness that made them keep her alive. They did not treat her like the others. Alara was kept in a luxurious enclosure, given a comfortable bed, the best food, and treated with an almost strange reverence. But Alara was not fooled. She understood the predator's game, even if they had made the mistake of underestimating her. She was not content to be their pet, not content to live out her days in a gilded cage, serving the whims of these creatures. Alara watched the others. She observed how they had been tamed, how they had been broken. She refused to become one of them. She would find a way to escape, to reclaim her freedom. Jonas and Alara's paths would eventually cross. Both had been broken by the predators in different ways, but they had found something in each other, something that neither had expected, a sense of solidarity, a quiet understanding that they could fight back, together. It wasn't about force. It wasn't about direct confrontation. It was about using their wits, using the predators' underestimation of humans to their advantage. It started small, with secret conversations and small gestures that the predators might have overlooked. At first, it was just an alliance of survival, an unspoken agreement to not give in entirely. But soon, they began to realize something more, something that terrified the predators. They were learning, they were adapting, and they would find a way to escape. But it wasn't easy. The predators watched them closely, waiting for any sign of rebellion. And yet, in the midst of their surveillance, in the quiet moments when they thought no one was looking, Jonas and Alara began to plant the seeds of their escape. They would find a way out of the cages they had been placed in, a way to slip through the cracks in the system the predators had built. It would take time, it would take patience, and it would take all of their cunning. But for the first time in a long time, Jonas and Alara felt something they had almost forgotten: hope. The predators had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated the human will to survive, the drive to adapt, to fight. And in doing so, they had made the mistake of giving humanity a chance. It was a long road, full of dangers and obstacles, but the predators had made one critical error. They had treated humans as nothing more than pets. And that, in the end, would be their undoing. Jonas and Alara would prove that humanity was not destined to be subjugated forever. They would find a way to break free, to reclaim their place in a world that had been stolen from them. and they would make the predators regret ever underestimating them. End note. The world was in chaos, and yet there were still those who clung to the idea that it could be saved, that the predators who had taken over humanity's cities, homes, and lands could be stopped. The remnants of human civilization were scattered across the globe, divided between those who had given in to the new order and those who had not. It was in the shadows of this fractured world that Jonas and Ilara, two survivors of the initial onslaught, met each other. They were strangers at first, merely two people living in a world that no longer recognized them, but fate had a different plan for them. Jonas had learned the hard way that surviving meant more than just avoiding the predators. It meant becoming something they would never expect, an opportunist, a master of patience, and a silent observer. He had once been part of a rebellion, but that had long since fallen apart. The other members had been slaughtered, and Jonas had learned that brute force could not defeat these creatures. The predators were too intelligent, too well organized. The rebellion had been naive, but it had also planted a seed in him, one that he would nurture until it grew into something far more dangerous. Ilara, on the other hand, had always been the opposite. Captured early on, she had been kept in a luxurious cage, a pet, but not one of the ordinary humans who were used for sport or treated with indifference. The predators had treated her as something more, something precious. She wasn't kept as food or for entertainment, but as something to be admired, perhaps even worshipped. It was a strange kind of captivity, one that afforded her comfort, but also a sense of helplessness. She was treated as an object, an ornament to be displayed, and though her surroundings were lavish, the truth was always clear: she was not free. Working as an ant, Jonas had watched her from a distance, from his own prison. The predators were clever in the ways they kept humans in line, their enclosures carefully designed to prevent any escape. The ones who tried were swiftly punished. Jonas had seen others break under the pressure, the weight of captivity too much to bear. Some of the humans who lived under the predator's rule had lost their will to fight, their minds dulled by the constant fear and the insidious control the creatures held over them. It wasn't a physical domination, but a psychological one. Humans were not treated as equals, but as pets. Their minds were twisted, broken, and molded into something docile, something obedient. But Jonas and Ilara were different. They hadn't broken. Not yet. And as fate would have it, they found each other. It happened slowly at first, a glance here, a moment of connection there. Jonas had always been the watcher, the one who observed without drawing attention to himself, and so he had seen Ilara's struggle. It wasn't the typical struggle for freedom, at least not in the way most people thought of it. She had learned the ways of the predators, learned how to appease them, how to live within her cage without drawing their ire. But she had never been truly free, and that fact gnawed at her. It wasn't until a fateful day when the predators began to turn their attention to the humans they had kept in captivity that Jonas and Ilara's paths truly crossed. The predators were evolving, adapting in ways that made them even more dangerous. They had already learned that humans could be trained, could be made to serve them willingly. But now they were experimenting. It wasn't enough to control humanity through fear. They wanted to see what else they could do. They wanted to push the limits of what humans could endure, to test the boundaries of obedience. Jonas had seen one of the predators, a towering beast that resembled a cross between a reptile and a feline, approach Ilara's enclosure. It was one of the creatures who had shown a strange, almost affectionate interest in her, and she, in turn, had learned to behave in ways that kept it from becoming violent. But Jonas could see the way the predator moved, the way its eyes glowed with a mixture of curiosity and hunger. It was watching her, studying her. There was something in its gaze, something that made him uneasy. The predator wasn't simply observing, it was testing. and the third member of the pair was Helen Daly. And that was when Jonas knew. This was the moment. The predator had grown bored with the usual games, and it was looking for something more, something that would force a change. Jonas had seen it before, and the way the creatures toyed with their pets, the way they slowly stripped away the humanity from those they captured. They weren't just after submission. They wanted something deeper. They wanted to break their pets so thoroughly that they would no longer be capable of rebelling, of even thinking for themselves. Elara had been living a quiet, controlled life, but now, as the predator circled her enclosure, she could feel the change. It was subtle at first, the predator's approach, the way it moved with calculated precision, but Elara had learned long ago that she needed to be aware of every movement, every glance. Something was wrong. The predator wasn't just interested in her anymore. It was curious, hungry, testing. She could see it in its posture. She could feel the change in the air. Jonas watched from his own cage, his mind racing. He couldn't act yet, not until he knew how the predator would respond. The moment was delicate. If he intervened too early, he might ruin everything. But if he waited too long, it might be too late. He had learned to read the predators like a book, to understand their rhythms, their movements. They weren't invincible. They made mistakes. And Jonas knew how to exploit them. It was a dangerous game, but it was the only one they had left to play. And then, in an instant, the predator's intentions became clear. It lunged at Elara's cage, its massive claws scraping against the metal bars. Elara gasped, stepping back instinctively, but she didn't scream. She had learned long ago that screaming would only provoke the predator. Instead, she held her breath, waiting for the predator's next move. It circled her, its glowing eyes fixed on her, its tail twitching with a predatory excitement. She stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. Jonas had seen enough. He moved quickly, using the moment of distraction to slip through the small crack in his cage. He had planned for this moment, prepared for it in ways most others hadn't. He knew the layout of the cages, the routines of the predators. He knew that the predator circling Elara would be momentarily distracted, and that was all the opening he needed. He darted across the room, moving silently, his body tense with the anticipation of what he was about to do. This was no longer a fight for survival, it was a fight for freedom. Elara, still trapped in her enclosure, heard the movement behind her and turned just in time to see Jonas slide into view. Her eyes widened with surprise, but she didn't speak. There was no time for words. They both knew that now. Jonas had seen the predator's approach and had calculated his move with precision. He reached out to Elara, his hand grazing the cold metal of her cage, his fingers brushing against the cool surface. For a brief moment their eyes met, two souls caught in the web of a world that sought to destroy them. It was an unspoken promise, a shared understanding of the risks they were taking. Jonas took a deep breath, his pulse racing. The predator had paused for a moment, sensing the sudden shift in the air. It wasn't fooled. It had seen Jonas move and it recognized the challenge. But it wasn't ready for what would come next. Jonas had calculated every movement, every angle. He knew the predator's limits. And then, just as the predator lunged toward him, Jonas sprang into action. He had used every ounce of his strength, every bit of cunning he had developed over the years to set this trap in motion. He wasn't just trying to escape. He was trying to teach the predators that humanity was not to be underestimated, that they could fight back. Jonas knew that it was time for the predators to learn that their prey was no longer afraid. As the predator charged, Jonas moved with lightning speed, his hand reaching for a weapon, a simple tool he had fashioned from scraps. But it was enough. In that moment, he took the predator by surprise, his movements fast, precise, and deadly. The predator screeched, its claws scraping against the floor as it tried to regain control, but it was too late. Jonas had already disabled it, and Elara was freed. The predator, momentarily stunned, backed away. It was defeated, but only for now. Jonas and Ilara stood together, breathing heavily, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. They were free, for now. But they both knew that this victory was only temporary. The predators would learn. They would adapt. And they would come for them. But in that moment, as the adrenaline faded and the silence settled in, there was one thing that mattered. They had taken the first step. And in a world that had been broken, that was enough to ignite the spark of rebellion. They were no longer just pets. They were no longer just prey. They were humans, and they would fight for their freedom, no matter the cost.